this computer. Hi, everybody. This is Beth from Around the Table Yarns. Today is the first day of Sock Club for July and August. We're going to be doing Summerlee Design Company's Little Boxes socks. It is a shorty sock. I can't seem to get my video camera to go darker now. It was dark for a second and then it went away. I'm supposed to stop messing with this, but I wonder if I turned it off and on. Hold, please. It's me. Okay, I'm going to try turning this on again and seeing if we get it better. That's a little better. That's a little better. Okay, anyway, Summerlee's pattern is a stranded colorwork sock worked from the ankle down with one repeat of the pattern before you start the heel. I guess you can see it better here. So there's one repeat of the stranded colorwork pattern before you set a line of waste yarn for the afterthought heel, and then you continue in the colorwork until you reach the toe. So what we're planning to do tonight is get our cast on done, and then I'm going to talk about the stranded colorwork, and then we're going to set the line for the afterthought heel. And then this part of it you'll do on your own. It's just working in the round. So once we get past setting the afterthought heel line in, we'll work on this on our own. When we come back together, we will finish the toe and then pick up and finish the heel. So it's only a 2-session sock because there isn't so much to learn on this sock as there have been on socks in the past. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the cast on. We have demonstrated cast ons before, so this isn't like rocket surgery, big news to anybody, but we will demonstrate the cast on all together. And getting my yarn out, getting my needle out. Oh, hello. Okay, getting my needle out. And I just want to show you because I've started it already. So when we get to the point where we're talking about, I'm going to show you the cast on and how I join it. But then I'm going to demonstrate on my already started sock. But this is the front of my sock. This is the top, or the top of my foot. So this will go like that. And this line of the darker color here is my afterthought heel in place. So I'm going to set an afterthought heel in place down here just to demonstrate it. But I'm not going to get from here to here in the hour that we have because that would be impossible. But I want to talk a lot about stranded colorwork and socks. So first of all, does anybody have any questions about the pattern that you want to ask now while we're live? So Elfrida started this sock and she was doing it on double points and it came out and it was too big. And Cynthia started this sock and she did a gauge swatch and it was perfect, maybe a little small. So she chose to do a bigger size and it looked too big. And there's a real question mark about sizing this. So if you are choosing to do a swatch, remember that it's best to do your swatch in the round. And if you're doing it in the round, you would be doing the stranding as well as the carrying the yarn behind. Or you could just start it and try it on and see how it works. What I find is that with this kind of sock, you are creating this line. So here's the sock and here's the line that you put in, and then you knit the whole thing down like this and you put in a toe. So it just looks like a tube sock, and this is a line of waste yarn. When we will put the stitches on either side of the waste yarn back on the needles, and we'll pick that out and it will create an opening into which we can insert another toe. And so that's what happens from the side. That's what it looks like from the side. This all opens up. So this is this line opened up, not to scale. And that's the top of the sock. So the problem is when it's like this, it's really hard to try on. So I think of a foot, and I'm going to use a fresh piece of paper. A foot comes down like this. And then there's a big toe, right? And here's your ankle bone. So I kind of imagine there's a line here. And where we put that waste yarn is going to be essentially this line. And this is a perpendicular, so this is a 90-degree angle. And it touches the front of the foot. So it's kind of an imaginary line. But if you imagine a line here and a line here, this is what, when we open this up, we're going to be creating this 90-degree turn. And it won't go across the whole foot. It will be from here. So I tend to measure from the front of my foot. I tend to measure where that's going to start from the front of my foot. From the, sorry, the front of my leg. So I tend to hold this up and try to line that line up with the front of my leg. So I pull it on until this hit the leg and then see how far forward it goes. And that's my rough way of sizing them. And that's worked for me in the past. She does give measurements, so you can use the measurements as well. But if you like to try your socks on and you don't want to put the heel in before you finish the toe, which is how the pattern is written, to not do the heel until we're all the way done with the toe, then that's kind of where I want you to imagine. Another way to do that would be to use a cardboard cutout of your foot and try it on, or lay it alongside, but to have that be about, I think she says 1.5 inches from the edge is the, sorry, 1.5 inches is the amount of length for the heel that you would imagine, and then 1.5 inches for the toe. But I have always just kind of laid that line across my foot right in front so that it could not, you know, the leg is there, it can't go any further back. So if I can line that up there and then I go forward, I want to end my knitting typically at the beginning of my pinky toe. So I tried this on the recipient, who's Maeve, and I have another about 6 squares to go before I get to where their pinky toe is. But I will try it on again to make sure. So 6, and I should get to about 11 because Maeve has big feet. But I'm going to double check that before I get too far. So she, Summer Lee, talked about in the pattern having this measurement here between where the heel line is and where the toe line is. This measurement here is, this is 1.5 inches and this is 1.5 inches. And so if that's your whole foot measurement from here to here, your whole foot minus 3 equals, what do we want to call that? The instep length. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing I want to say about sizing. The second thing I want to say about sizing is that stranded color work is a variable art. So mine remarkably looks not corrugated for once. My stranded color work, especially on small circumference, it can just be a lot harder to do. And you may find that you use a different technique for stranded color work when you're working socks than you might work for, say, the yoke of a sweater when you have more stitches and a bigger cord if you're using a circular needle. The reason that that's the case is because the strand or the float of yarn is carried across from one place to another. So the float of yarn in this case, my contrast color is this minty green, and it is floating behind 3 stitches of my main variegated color. That float, 3 stitches is this much yarn. So if I pulled that straight, it would go from here, off the page. But the float is only carrying across from there to there. So the float is much shorter than the length of yarn that's involved in the 3 stitches. And so what that does is it puts the brakes on for stretchiness, and you can only stretch so far. So there are a lot of ways to talk about doing stranded color work. But the way that I like best is to be sloppy, to make big sloppy stitches and let the elasticity and the natural sort of boing of the wool pull them back together. So before we get to any other part of this pattern, I just want to demonstrate what I'm talking about. I am doing this in the magic loop style, and I am using 2 hands for the stranded color work. So I'm going in and I'm using my left hand, which is my weaker hand for color work. I'm using my left hand, and let me make sure I'm in the picture. Yell at me, please, if I go off the picture, because I'm looking down at my knitting closer than I'm looking at the thing. So I don't normally carry with my left finger. I normally wrap with my right. So when I do stranded color work, I want the fewer number of stitches to be on my weaker hand, especially in a pattern like this where it doesn't change. It's all the same. It's 1, 2, 3, change, 1, 2, 3, change, 1, 2, 3, change. And then there's a row of the contrast color. Okay. If this were a different kind of a pattern, I would be worried about dominance in my color work. So those of you who have done stranded color work before may have heard the term dominance, and it has to do with how prominent the stitches are that appear in one color or the other. So dominance in this case is typically established, or the yarn carried on the leftmost side, whether you are a picker or a thrower, or you hold them both in one hand, left or right, the yarn that is coming from the leftmost side as you knit the fabric is a longer stitch, a slightly longer stitch, and it appears more prominent in the patterning than the other yarn. So if you're looking at my hands, this one's coming from the left. And so as I make those stitches, there's more of it in the face of my work. Okay. So that would be really important if I wanted that color to show up more. I'd want it to be on the left-hand side, whether I'm strong with my left-hand side or not. Or if I were carrying it over one hand, this, on one hand, I would do it so that that was the leftmost yarn. Or if I were doing it over, and I don't know how you do it this way. I am not strong. I'm not dominant on my left. But if you were holding the yarns on the left, again, you'd want it to be the furthest one over. The one that you want the most prominent is the one that's over to the left. However, with this pattern, I think it's okay to play around a little and see what's most comfortable, because if you pick a contrasting enough contrast color, so my line color, I think it will show up fine, and you don't have to carry it on the left for it to matter. So the moral to that story is I would carry the one that you knit the least of in your non-dominant side, even if that's the right. So if you're a picker, what I'm saying is if you're a picker, put it on the throw side. And if you're a thrower, put it on the picking side. And if you're carrying them both on one side, God love you. You should be fine. But you don't want to, the one thing I don't think you should do is switch them around. I don't think you should switch the colors from left to right, because that alters how they appear in dominance. And it's not good practice for stranded color work. I think it's much better practice to sort of stick with one color on the left and one color on the right throughout a piece, because it will change. It can change the appearance of the piece, and that may be more important in some pieces than others. Okay, so when I'm doing this, I'm trying hard not to hold this too tightly. Remember I said about sloppy? And you can kind of see how sloppy this looks right here. You can see that my stitches are really big and oversized right at the top. So let me just show you what I mean. I'm pulling pretty tight on the first one and opening my stitches up really wide. And then when I make this stitch, I don't want to carry my non-dominant color so tightly. So I want to be able to go into it and grab a really big loop. And the reason I'm saying that is it's such a small circumference that you don't want to have to move them really far. I want this green yarn to travel at least an inch or so from where it came from last to where it's being formed into this stitch. And so making a big sloppy stitch is my compromise to what I normally do, which is knit with the yarn that you have more of. So normally what I do is I do that, and then I pull it down, and then I make a stitch so it's stretched even further away, and then I make the stitch, and then I keep going. I'm not worried about stretching out the one that's only passing behind one stitch. I'm really worried. I'm really mostly concerned about the tension of that stripe. So I'm trying to keep this fairly loose back here and make a big stitch. And you can see, even though I'm making a big stitch, by the time I've caused tension down the row, those stitches are resuming normal size. So even though I was loose and sloppy for all of these stitches, the tension that you create continuing to pull on the yarn on the left-hand side of the row, or as you move from right to left, that normalizes the size of the stitches over here. That's one way to do it. I don't know if anybody has any other suggestions or thoughts. We also talked this morning about sizing up or down and using double-pointed needles of different gauges than what she called for. Generally speaking, people who do picking, so people who knit continental, make a bigger stitch as you can see on my throws, my stitches are not so distorted. When I make a continental stitch, I literally open, look how wide I open up that stitch. And then I grab the yarn behind and I pull it through. That is how most people who do picking create their stitches. And they tend to have bigger stitches on the knit, typically, than I think it's on the knit, but they tend to have bigger stitches anyway. They're looser knitters. Not always, but a lot of, like if somebody tells me that they usually have to size down, I ask them if they knit continental, and about 8 times out of 10 they are knitting continental. And it's just a feature of that style that you tend to distort the stitch more in making it, and that can make for a looser gauge. But the reason I'm talking about this is I just want you to remember to keep the tension as loose as possible, because the float determines your final elasticity, and you want to be able to get this on the person's foot, your friend's foot, your kid's foot, whoever's foot. And so if you see a lot of puckering between, if it looks really corrugated, and I'm so grateful that this doesn't look corrugated, because sometimes it's hard. But I think it looks pretty good. This is a little bit, I'm getting a little bit of a ladder on the corner, on my turn. I'm pulling a little harder there. I feel like that's okay. I think with somebody's foot in there, it's going to flatten out. I can see that there are some stitches that are bigger than others. I know I dropped a couple when I was on the airplane, so who knows what that was. But I like it overall, and I think blocking will help it. I'm using one of our independent dyers. This is a colorway called Happy Dance from Ridiculous. And then my contrast colors, this is a mini skein from Perennial from Kelburn Woolens. And I've got 2 colors of that, a darker and a lighter. So I've got the darker as the cuff, and it's going to also be the heel. And then the lighter is the contrast color one that's running through it. Okay. Any questions on the stranding? Oh, you know what? I'm not looking at the chat. I don't see anything in the chat. Nope. Okay. Let me finish this row, and we're going to talk about putting in the starting the stitch. Starting the sock. Words. Okay. So I have another set of needles here. And here's my yarn. Very untidy ball. When I measure out, so when I'm measuring out for sock yarns, I'm using the size where I have over 70 stitches on the around the needles. So I have to cast on over 70 stitches. And I like to use a long tail cast on version called the German twisted cast on. It's also the old Norwegian cast on. But people are often wondering, like, how long do I make my tail to cast on a pair of socks? Because nobody wants to cast on twice. So I like to have a lot of extra, and I measure out an arm length, and think of this arm length as 30 stitches. So if I'm doing over 70, I'm going to do 2 full arm lengths, and then maybe some more, and call it a day. Now I'm going to do the German twisted cast on. Because I use a lot of extra, I don't really mind if I have the tail over my thumb versus the working yarn. But in this case, I do have the tail over my thumb and the working yarn in back. I go with my needle in between here and just twist it once around. So I stick my needle from top to bottom, pull out on that first strand and twist it around my needle. Okay, and I put my finger on it so it doesn't slip off. I'm going to take my needle and think of this like loop on your thumb. I'm going to take my needle all the way under and all the way back to the top of my thumb and run it down the length of my thumb and bring it towards me. When I do that, do you see that one stitch right there? That's the edge of the loop. It's not my stitch. It's just the edge of the loop that I'm coming through on my thumb. Now I'm going to travel over the strand coming from my pointer. That's my new stitch, but I can't get it through easily unless I pull all the way back and try and just get my point right through that. So what I do is I just kind of roll it over and under. Oh, did that right? And bring it out with my thumb. Let's do it again because that looks like a lot. So you're holding a stitch on the needle. You're going to go all the way under and down the thumb. Come forward towards your face and then over the strand closest to you from the pointer finger. Come back towards your face. And sometimes I bend my thumb a little bit and I see that opening and I just go back in it and back towards my face. I don't let go with my thumb right away. I lift the needle up away from me and away from my thumb, and then I use my thumb to gently hug it up to the needle. When I say gently, this is one of those places where I like to imagine my dear Auntie Helen, who had osteoporosis, who I was very careful not to hug too tightly. So I want you to think of hugging very gently around the needle. You don't want to create a dense stitch that's hard to get into. So around and down, over and back through. Still in the position for a long tail cast on. So normally we would come to here and up. In this case, we're coming all the way under and back down, all the way over, back to the front. Back to the front opens it up a little bit, and then you can go back through that loop. And I need a bunch of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and do them. I'm going to pause the recording. So while I was knitting the rest of the stitches, and we're going to demonstrate in a second, one of our participants, Maureen, was talking with me about her questions. Summer Lee did a video for this sock, which I'm not going to show you because it's already a video on YouTube. So you can look on her website or from the pattern. I think there's a link. And the video will show you exactly how to place the heel. And it will also show you how to pick up stitches around the heel. But it is limited in its information about gauge and sizing. And so what Maureen gathered from it, you can say.
Well, she was silent. Some patterns say, negative ease. But what she did say was, it's, what you're going to get is you're going to get what you're going to get. You may want to size up because of the floats, and you may want to also um, make your heel a couple inches after you knit. You put your waist in so that you can try on your sock to see if it fits instead of doing the whole down to the toe and then putting the heel in, so that you have a better gauge, pardon the pun, on how your sock is going to fit. So it's something for you guys to consider.
And we have two
But
people.
I thought
I was going to just say we have two
the
people
video
who are
was
going to do
good.
that. Mm-hmm. So we recommend
Mm-hmm.
the video. And
Mm-hmm.
Summerlee's videos, I think, are all uniformly nice. I'm setting up to
Mm-hmm.
do my magic loop and start this. So I'm just put this back up. So I have 70 plus stitches. I'm not going to talk about the sizing because this is a copyrighted pattern. So I'm just going to get to the halfway point. And what I will do is I will pinch my cable closed and pull it through my halfway point. It distorts the stitches a little bit. I'm not worried about it. I want the needle with the working yarn to be further away from me and the stitches to be inside. So there's my working yarn reaching away. So my needles are pointed to the right. My working yarn is off to the right. My needles are not equal. I need to pull this loop bigger. And what I want is to actually have all my stitches on both needles when I get started. I like to just see everything laid out, because when it's on the needles, you can control whether or not there's any extra twists in your loop. So I'm going to just push these up on the needle. Let's see, since it's this, it looks like the same color. So as you can see, I'm still holding these stitches parallel to each other. They're attached at the bottom. I'm pushing them up the needle so I can hold them together and make sure there's nothing twisted all around. So it's not looped around the needle like that. I want to make sure that all of the stitches are laying on the inside. They're kind of facing their friends on the other side. And think of gravity taking the stitches down to the floor, so then you can turn them to the bottom of the needle if you want. I hold my stitches parallel, other two needles of my cable needle, my circular needle, parallel. I have this much tail, so I have plenty of tail left over. I don't need it all, and it's going to confuse me. So I'm going to break it off and save that little smidgen for something else useful. My working yarn is attached to the needle that is furthest from my body. I take the working yarn up. Oh, that was my tail. Take the working yarn up and over, leave the tail down there, and then pull that tip, the tip that's furthest from your body gets pulled out and turned. So there's a loop here that allows you to turn all the way and get into the first stitch on the closer needle to your body. But there's also still a loop on the other side. So I have a loop on both sides. Sometimes we talk about having Mickey Mouse ears. So you can see the loop on both sides. So now I'm going to move these stitches into position. I'm holding my needles closely together. They're parallel because my next stitch, if this is my last stitch that I made, this is my next stitch. I don't want them to be 1.5 inches apart. I want them to be pretty close. So I'm just adjusting my things. I'm going to go into, that was the twisted stitch. So it might be a little bit tighter. And one of the things I do recommend is when you get cleanly into a stitch, if it's tight, give it a little pull. There's no rule that says you can't open it up with force. So when you get into that stitch and you want to make it bigger so you can make the stitch cleanly, make sure you are not splitting the yarn, and really see how far apart I get it. It's okay to do that, especially if you're making a stitch, a first stitch, or like getting into an SSK or a knit two together or a purl two together where you're coming around from behind, or purl two together through the back loop and it's really hard. Get into the stitch that you want with whatever size needle will get there, and then pull it open a little bit and give yourself a little room to work. Then I'm going to wrap the working yarn around. Because I pulled it over the needle, when I wrap it around, it is coming the shortest distance and it is not causing an extra loop around. And that's only if I'm knitting the first stitch. If I were purling the first stitch, I would not have lifted it up. And I make that first stitch, and see that length of yarn between the first stitch and the last stitch that I'd made. I want to tighten that. Personally, I think that I would want that a little bit tighter. I want this stitch to be as close to the cable of my needle as I can make it. And then I stop worrying about gauge and tension. So I'm intentionally tight on that first one. Other people have different techniques, but that one I find actually helps me continue to have good tension. Then I just knit normally. From that point on, I just knit normally. And I go, and you can see, even though I pulled it real tight, look at the stretch that I'm getting here where my finger is, between my fingertips. I'm like a 1/4 inch away. And it's a knit, I believe it's a knit one, purl one rib. And so I'm just going to work that around. Now, some people like to do one extra stitch, and then they pull the last stitch, the extra stitch, over the first stitch. To me, I don't want to think about, I don't want to do one more thing. I just want to get going. And part of the reason I feel that way is there's always going to be a tail where you join. There has to be. You have to start that trail somewhere. And if you've done a looser or tighter or whatever, if you've left the tail there, you have something to hide the damages with. And that to me is more important than knitting something in a ring and having it look perfect. I think you can make it look perfect when you're done, and you're still going to have to weave in that tail. So you might as well use it to make it look as good as possible. And get on with the knitting. Kathy's agreeing with me. She's nodding vigorously. She believes in me. Okay, so that is my cast on. So German twisted. And the reason I like the German twisted, you can kind of see it here in my video. Bring it up closer. To me, it has a beaded appearance. There's like a rounded bead kind of a look to the bottom of it. It is not, it's not in ribbing, but it takes ribbing very nicely. And that twist that we gave it, that extra little loop that we went around, I think gives it a little bit more elasticity. I think that's where the extra springiness comes from. And that's why I like it. I like it because I like the way it looks. You can actually do it in ribbing if you want to. It's not hard to figure out, but I would say first master doing it one way before you start adding extra like knits and purls to it. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my first half of stitches. And I'm working in a knit one, purl one, rib. Oh, split my yarn. So one way that I avoid splitting yarn is I keep my tip of my right needle touching the left needle as I go into the stitch, especially with these little tiny ones. If you're somebody who just puts your needle in, like you just stab at it, you're much more likely to get a split loop. But if you're touching, there's kind of a point where my right needle tip is going into the stitch and I run it along the left needle as I go into that space. And I really feel like that helps me keep from splitting a lot of stitches. And it helps me sort of knit by feel a little bit. Okay, there's always going to be a little pull as you turn these. I'm not too worried about it because, as I said, as you turn these things and work on, the tension of your yarn pulling to the next stitches helps to close that up. So when I turn, I push in my needle that was out. Sorry, what am I doing? I push in my front needle first, and then, sorry, I was pushing in the wrong needle. Okay, so this is a great example of what can happen with Magic Loop that can make people confused. So first of all, remember we were trying to keep all of the stitches facing each other. So you can still do that here, and then identify where your working yarn is coming out of. It's coming out of the needle. So the needle tips are facing to the right, and it's coming out of the one that's further away from your body. Put it over that needle and push the stitches onto the tip of the other needle so that they're ready. These stitches have not been worked yet. These stitches have. So I'm getting these ready to work, holding my needles parallel still. The yarn is in place. And now without moving these stitches off the needle, I'm going to just pull that out. So I don't want to lose anything. I like to use my fingertips a lot to protect my stitches from coming off. I ended with a purl stitch, so I'm starting with a knit stitch. And again, I want to make that first knit stitch as close. So I kind of push the cable in with my hand or my thumb so that the cable and the stitch are next to each other. I just feel like that makes the first stitch not be so loose and prevents the laddering. And then I stop worrying about gauge at that point and knit normally. So especially for all of you who are practice knitters, the best tension is a tension that you're not thinking about and that you practice. Just like the best golf swing or the best tennis stroke or the best swimming stroke is something that you just do without thinking. So you can adjust it as you need to. When you need to pull harder or push harder, you can, but so that it's just nice and easy and you make stitches of generally the same size every time. Okay. So I could keep going, but I think we get the idea, and that's how we're doing our cuff. So in the case of making the right, you all see that? I feel like the light got adjusted for the maybe there's more sunlight coming in now. Create a little shade. Does that help? Dark. Does that help a little bit? There's a little contrast there. Okay. So I just finished working across the front of my stitch. I'm not in the right row, but I just want to talk a little bit about placing the waste yarn for the heel, because that's the next thing that happens. We've talked a little bit about working in the pattern and doing the stranded color work, and we've talked about the cuff. And so now I want to just talk about placing the waste yarn for the heel. In the pattern, she gives you a step-by-step description of how to do this. And she also has a link to a video that shows you exactly what to do. If you are doing this on small circulars or magic loop, then you need to move the stitches that you put on waste yarn back onto the needles. But if you are using double pointed needles, you can just start with your waste yarn on the right side. So by that, I mean, here's where my waste yarn is. So I worked across, and then with the waste yarn, I worked from right to left with my waste yarn, and I stopped here, and my needle tips were both on this side. And then I slipped the stitches so they were on the right needle and the left needle was free. I slipped them back onto the left needle so the tips were on this side, on the right side. And then I was able to start knitting across. And that's because mine have a loop. So if you're on small circulars or magic loop, you must slide them back on to do this row. If you're on double points or 2 circular needles doing the small circumference knitting, then you will be able to just finish that and go back to the other side of your needle and work across with the main color again. The other innovation of this sock that I think is really cool is she does, and this is why there's sort of extra steps in her afterthought, or what she calls a forethought heel. She has a row of main color that is unbroken. Do you see that? It's unbroken by the stripe. So the stripe is interrupted for the row before and the row after the waste yarn is placed. And the reason for that is the stranded color work pulls so that if you were to make, for example, this line, the line of your afterthought heel, you could, but where it crosses the stripe of my contrast color, there will be a little divot or hole around the heel, and it will be on the top of the heel and the bottom of the heel. And so Summerlee didn't like that, and she figured out if you have just a smooth line of main color on either side of your waste yarn, you won't get those divots. Look at all my golf references today. I don't even play golf. I once caddied though, because I couldn't hit the ball, but I helped my friend carry their clubs so I could go on the walk around the golf course. So because she has a video for this, I guess I feel like we could link to that in our video. So I will put a link to that on our YouTube page so you can go to that and watch it. But I just want to advise, if you are using small circulars or magic loop, about having to slip it back on, because people were doing both ways this morning. We had both the small circulars, magic loop, and double points. And so some people were like, but what do I do? And other people were like, well, you just start on the other end. Well, you can't just start on the other end if both of your needle tips are over here and there's just a loop over here. Okay. So the next step is to work until you get to the toe. It is harder to figure that out without trying it on. So I've given you my best advice with my beautiful, stunning drawing. of how to figure out how to get that far. So this measurement should be an inch. You should end from here. She's estimating 1.5 inches. So this measurement to 1.5 inches short of your foot. And from, I would say from this point, or from 1.5 inches if you were using a cutout of your foot. Ooh, there's the toes. You would want to measure 1.5, sorry, 1.5 inches from there. That's where you'd want your line to be. So you'd want, on your cardboard cutout of your foot, you could put a 1.5 inch mark. You would line up that to this. Line that up to this, and then you would work until you were 1.5 from there. And you'd want this to fit in that space between. Does that make sense? I see nods. I think it's a fun pattern. It's not hard to do. I started this about 4 days ago. So, and I've had a chance to knit and nap while I was working on it. I think there's a lot of possibilities with this. Like if you got 2 or 3 different yarns, you could do it again because you'll have lots left over. You could do it again and reverse your colorways. I know a bunch of our customers decided to use up mini skeins, and this pattern is actually perfect for mini skeins because you don't use more than about 90, I think it's about 90 yards for any one color. So you can really play with colors that you have in your stash. For those of us, oh, I've gone over, sorry. For those of us who are going to be doing the next one, I just wanted to hold. Escape. Pull up the other. So I have picked a pattern for the last Okay, can everybody see that? The pattern for this is going to happen in October and November, but we will meet 3 times. We will be meeting the beginning and the end of October and later in November. And this pattern has a really cool, look at that ribbing and that cool heel. So I just thought this was really fun. Also, as an ally and parent of somebody who identifies in the LGBTQIA plus grouping, I am very conscious of being an ally and being supportive wherever I can. It does not have to be knitted in rainbow colors. It does not have to be striped, but I thought it was a really cool pattern. And so it's Proudfoot by Rue Meeks Johnson. from Kama Sutra Fiber Arts, and I have to move my thing. It's $8 on Ravelry. It is a good stash buster. Lots of, and she gives you very specific information for how much yarn you need. So you need about 32 yards or 30 meters and 20 yards each of the colors for, I think this is the Progress Pride flag. Mini skeins work really nicely. Scraps and not making them matching is also an option. But I thought it was a really neat looking design, and I'm looking forward to making that quilt. So that is for October. Again, like all short socks, you can make that leg longer if you want to. We may make it a little bit longer. I don't know. I haven't done my sample. I just picked it recently. Okay. So next month in August, is it the 6th, 7th? Whatever that first Monday is, I believe, is Sock Club. So
I think it's the 7th.
The 7th, because we have the retreat. So it comes right after the retreat. Yay! So it's
and
the
voting on the 8th, yeah.
And voting on the 8th. And don't forget to vote.
That's right.
Okay. Any questions?
Nope.
Okay. You guys have a great month.
You too.
Enjoy making your socks. Don't forget to make the second one.
Oh, yeah. Will do.
2 at a time.
Yeah.
Do them 2 at a time. I don't love to do 2 at a time with stranded. I have to say that.
Well,
one more.
Roll the dice.
I will make them 2 at a time on separate needles.
That's what I'm doing, on separate needles.
On separate needles, that's fine. 2 at a time on the same set of needles, and it's like, just kill me.
Yeah. I have a rat's nest right now, so.
Pull from the tangle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right. You guys have a great night.
Me too.
We'll see you
ya
soon.
Thanks.
Bye.